Greetings and welcome to Creative Briefing, ad hoc internet stream show that looks at and explores all sides of creativity and what it means to be creative. At least that's my goal, that's my aim, to inspire and motivate people of all walks, creative, non-creative, to find their inner creativity and bring that out of them. Today I'm looking at the Shapes tool in Adobe Photoshop, and I was with a student last week and we were going over this, and it was really clear to me that it's misunderstood or underused, underappreciated, and there's a lot of hidden functionality in there. I mean, it's not Adobe Illustrator, but a lot of the things you can do with it will often negate a need to jump into Illustrator just for some, for some simple things. The shape tool in Photoshop can achieve quite a lot, and I'm going to dig into that today, go into some detail and look at a lot of the hidden functionality and the different ways and means of using that. So first, before we get into that, I just want to say, I'm Adam from Influxx Media Production. We do education and content for small business, marketing, and if you want to subscribe to the channel, we're always doing tips, tutorials, little insights. I mean, Creative Briefing is 2-3 times a week. We've got a small back catalog and it's growing, so please, if you like this, if you like what you watched today, please stick through to the end. There's going to be a lot of material covered, and consider subscribing and giving a thumbs up if you learned something. Alright, so with all that due diligence out of the way, let's get on with the okay, so the shapes layer. First of all, as I always like to say, go into your preferences and under interface, workspace, tools. The preferences have changed somewhat, so it might be in a different way. I'm on CC 18, I believe, and CC 20 they're in a different version, different place, and also in before CC 18 they were somewhere else. But the thing we're looking for is this. By default is checked. Used Shift key for tool switch. First thing I do with any fresh install of Photoshop is turn that off. I hate that Shift key feature, so make sure that's turned off. Why? Because the shortcut for the Shapes tool is U, and as you can see with each of these tools, it has like a little disclosure triangle at the bottom. If you click on it and hold, you can see there's all kinds of options, different tools within that one tool, and you can see the shortcut for them is U. So we don't want to have to click, hold, release, select. That's cumbersome and time wasting. We don't want to have to do Shift U all the time. Just tapping U will enable us to cycle through those tools. So that's the first thing. U key brings up the shape tool. I'm just going to select a circle for right now, and make sure the Shift key is disabled for tool selection in that preference. So keep that layers palette open. The first thing with the shape tool is the mode. Up here in the top left, you can see that we have shape, path and pixels, and I'll discuss what each one of those means. So shape, if you draw a shape, it's going to create a shape layer. And you can see, if you look in the layer palette, the icon, the thumbnail has this little icon in the corner that shows it's a shape layer. Also, so if no layers are selected and you select the layer, you might see like the visual display change a little. If we can zoom in a little closer, you can see we've got this nice anti-aliased crisp rendering, if I select the layer, you can see now we've got this, it's looking a little bit mushy, and that's because the actual path on that shape layer is now selected too. If I hit the A key, and you can see that selects the tool down here, and you can see there's the I call it the black arrow and the white arrow, but there's the path selection tool and the direct selection tool. So that comes into play a lot when you're working with shapes, because shapes are vector paths. Everything that you do in Illustrator is a vector path. Shapes is just what Photoshop calls them. It's just a vector path. So you can select the shapes by clicking on the shape. Now it's possible to have the layer selected but not the shape selected, as in this case. Nothing is selected. I select ellipse 1 shape layer, and you can see the actual visual indication changes. I've got that visual sort of mushiness around the perimeter of the shape. If I actually, with the black arrow selected, if I click on that, now you see I get these. If I zoom in here, you can see I've got this node, and every node is also solid, it's filled. If I hit the A key again, because I don't have to use the shift key because I've got that preference set, I can also toggle between the black and white arrows. If I choose the white arrow, I can then select individual nodes on the vector path. These are Bezier paths, and they are described by the nodes on the path and the tangents of these pull-out handles. So we can change the shape of the path. If you're familiar with Illustrator, obviously you're familiar with this. If you're just a Photoshop user and you've never used vector drawing before, this is how vector shapes are described. The nodes on the path and the tangential handles that pull out from them. So be aware that with the white arrow, I'm selecting individual nodes. If I select the path, I'm not selecting anything. I can click on the path, and if I drag, I'm just dragging that segment, and that's going to, depending on where I drag that segment from, it's going to determine what's happening. I'm manipulating these tangent handles but not the nodes. I'm just changing how the tangential handles behave within that segment. So I have to select a node directly, which is why it's called the direct selection tool, to move it. Conversely, if I hit A again and I've got the black arrow tool, the path selection, if I click anywhere on the path, I'm moving the whole path. I can be less precise. I don't have to select just a node. I don't have to click on the path, and I'm not going to manipulate the path. I'm just repositioning the path in its entirety. Okay, so let's delete that. If I delete the path, the shape layer goes with it. The two are, unified. They're inseparable. For the most part. We can get to that in a little bit. So I'm going to redraw the path again. I'm going to hit the U key to bring up the circle path. And first thing I want to look at is the options for drawing the path. If I click on this, you can see I have these radio buttons. The first one is unconstrained, which means I can draw the path any which way I want to do it. The next option is circle, which I can just draw a circle from where I click to where I release. It's going to draw a perfect circle. The next option is I can put in a fixed size, and I can say I'm working within a certain size document, and I know I want it to be 500 pixels by 500 pixels, or maybe something a little less regular, say 500 by 250. Then I can just click and place that anywhere. It's going to be set to that size. Wherever I click, it's going to establish it, but where I release is where it's going to draw it. So that's the fixed size. I can also set the proportion. So I could say 500 to 250, and it's going to keep that ratio. Obviously 500 to 250 obviously can be divided down. If you're good at math, you can, do 2 to 1, and it will yield the same results. So I can just, without having to do any kind of modifier keys, which I'll get to in a second, I can just draw it out to the ratio that I want. Little checkbox at the bottom, from center. That's if you've got a center point, if you've got artwork you're trying to match to, that you have a center point to. Wherever you draw that circle, it will originate from that center point and draw it outwards. So if I click, I'm dragging down, and it might be easier to illustrate if I bring up a couple of guides, which we can see. And if I click here on the center point, now I'm drawing, you can see I'm drawing out from the center. All very good, very useful. I'm going to switch that off and go back to unconstrained, and I'm going to show you how to achieve those a little bit quicker with some modifier keys. The first one, if I hold down Shift and I click, or if I click and then hold Shift. So let me restate that to be absolutely clear. If I click and I've established, and I haven't released the mouse button, I'm just drawing the curve, I'm moving the mouse around. I then hold Shift. Now I'm constraining that circle to an absolute circle, and it works the same with the square. I'm just going to constrain that to an absolute square, 1 to 1, width to height. So no need to jump into here every time you want to get different results. You can achieve the same things quicker by holding down Shift. So if I want to draw from the center, I can click in the center, hold down, click first, establish the circle, then hold Option, and I can draw my circle. Then I can hold Shift, and I can constrain it to a circle. So Option Shift, post click will constrain the path to the center and draw a perfect circle. So why post click? Well, as you saw there, if I hold down Option, now with any tool, if I hit Option, it automatically by default brings up the color picker, the eyedropper tool. So for example, if I have a shape down here and it's this color, and I'm going to draw another circle next to it. If I hit Option first, all I'm doing is sampling that color. Excuse me. So click, then hold Option. Now here, and then I can hit Shift as well to constrain it. Another thing, and this is the same with selections, with any of Photoshop's creation tools, generation tools. If I'm clicking and drawing something, right now this second circle I'm adding is on top of the first circle. Obviously that doesn't benefit me, I don't want that. So if I hit the space bar, again I'm holding down, you can see from the camera that shows my keyboard, I'm holding down Option Shift, I hit the space bar. Now I can reposition that circle anywhere. Say I want the circle to be big, but I want it to be touching. Okay, but it's a little bit too big. Now I can continue to reposition that. As long as I'm continuing to hold the mouse button down, and I'm continuing to hold Option Shift, then I can release the space bar, and I can then release the mouse button. So those keyboard modifiers really help efficiencies, workflow. You're not clicking around in interfaces, you're just creating, generating, and those modifiers will help you achieve your goals quicker. I mean, obviously you can just hold down Shift and draw, and then select the tool and then go and position it. that's an extra step. It's perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Using the modifier tools while you're doing it, it's a little bit more direct and a lot more efficient. So we have our shapes. So we have two shape layers because the first, and we can see we have two layers because we've got the black outline which shows the two layers, and you can see in our layer stack I've got two layers. So if I draw another layer and I hit the U key again with nothing selected in the layers palette, and I just draw another layer, again, as soon as we have the tool active, we're able to set the color, set the stroke color, and set the stroke width, either through the slider or through numerically adding it. We can also decide what sort of path options we want. Similar, we've got corners, caps, and we can align it to the inside, outside, or the center, very much like Illustrator's stroke tools. I'll get to these more in a moment. So we draw our path, and it then uses the color information that we've set up here to do that. I'm going to bring this and hide it down here because it keeps popping up and it is quite annoying. So also, as you can see right here, I can change with our shape layers. I can then select the layer, or select the object within the layer. And here's a fundamental thing to know about shape layers in Photoshop. They're like their own self-contained ecosystem. You can have hundreds of shape layers within hundreds of shape objects within a shape layer. So I can have just one shape layer with an elaborate matrix of objects in it, and I'll get to that very, very shortly. So one of those things to be aware of. You don't have to create hundreds of layers. You can merge them, and when you're making selections or making choices, whatever you're doing to the layer, being aware of that, having the right layer in the layer stack selected, and having the right object within the layer selected. So I can then go back and change the color properties of that object. So let's look at the stroke. Actually, let me create a new. I'm just going to create a new one that's slightly larger, and let's look at some of these path options. So first one is solid, obviously. The next option is dotted, and if we deselect everything, I hide those guides, you can get an idea of what that looks like. Another thing to be aware of, with no layers selected, the selection tools, the black and the white arrows, do nothing. I'm clicking with the tool and I'm not able to select any of the paths because Photoshop doesn't know which path it want me to select. I have to select the layer first, then I can select the shape within that layer. So a little bit of a gotcha. You may have and a lot of my students, they forget about the black and white arrows, and they have the move tool and they're trying to select and it's not working. Or they'll have the arrow tool selected and they won't have a layer in the layer stack active, and they're trying to select and it's not working. So select the layer in the layer stack and then select the shape within that layer. It's a little bit obtuse, but once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. You can do it without thinking about it. So Let's look at, it's got the smaller dots. We can see what that looks like. Oh, very good. Then with the more options, you can then go in and like start customizing your, again, very much like Illustrator, you can customize your, let's do a dash of 6, then a gap of 3. So we've got like this custom dash that's like a kind of Morse code, a dot and then a dash. So that's quite useful. Then align. Let's make the path really thick so we can get an idea of what some of these options. Align. So you can see that right now the path, if you can see around the edge of the sort of the purple area, you can see slightly, if I deselect the layer and then I select it again, you can see slightly, like I said, that kind of sort of mushy aliased rendering. That is the path. And the stroke right now is aligned inside the path. If you're familiar with Illustrator, obviously you're familiar with this. Well, not obviously, maybe you aren't aware of this in Illustrator too. So what the align function does, I can align it to the center. So now the stroke, when I expand that stroke, it's expanding from the center. If I align the stroke to the outside of the path, now the stroke, the actual shape is contained in the interior. None of the stroke, you know, encroaches upon that filled area. So those 3 different stroking options really have a lot of power, and that gives you a lot of options for when you're laying out, especially for like user interface design. That comes into play a lot. Let's go back to a solid and let's look. Caps don't come into play unless we're dealing with open paths, and I'll look at that in a second. Also corners. So I'm going to delete this and create a rectangle, or let's create a funky shape. Make that a little bit bigger. Let's go back to the stroke options. I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. You can see right now again it's aligned to the inside of the path. I'm going to align that again to the outside. Corners right now are sharp. They're set to square, angled, and if you look at this node right here, you can see that it's a sharp angle. So let's see how that changes if we change that to round. Actually, maybe that won't be quite so obvious unless we go, there we go. So if I go back to sharp, if you take a look right here, and if I zoom in maybe a little bit, you can see what's going on. I have this sharp angle where each point in the star meet. If I go back to the corners and make that round, now you can see there's a smooth blend between this. Now it's not, if I align it to the outside, it kind of becomes moot because that stroke is defining. You're not going to. It's not going to smooth it for you on the inside of the stroke. The stroke is aligned to the outside. It would be different if, for example, let's just jump ahead of myself real quick. If I add a node here and then make it sharp. Okay, so now I don't need that, thank you very much. So I have a sharp angle and the stroke on the outside is now being rounded. If I go back to sharp, you can see that this angle here, if I select rounded, it's now going to round. It's going to round that. If I align it to the center again, now it's going to round both of these. If I align it to the inside, it's not going to round that because that is the path. It's not going to... How do I make this stupid little... Oh, jeez. Photoshop trying to be overly helpful. There should be, when you install Photoshop, there should be an option. How many years have you used Photoshop? And then it should then take all the helpful pop-ups away, because I don't need that sort of help anymore. It's irritating me more than it's helping me. So that's what the corners do. And then we also have chamfered. So that, or mitered, I think chamfered is my own made-up word. But so mitered, if I zoom back out, you can see the whole object. You can see that it kind of squares off those corners. I will say I don't ever recall having used that miter function. It doesn't yield the best, prettiest results. I'm going to line that back out to the outside again. You can see it's kind of cut off that one star point I added with a sharp angle. It's kind of lopped that end off. It's not very attractive. Okay, so let's look briefly at what caps do. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm just going to draw, well, getting into the pen tool territory, which I wasn't planning to cover today, but let's take a look at so obviously open paths can't be aligned to the inside because there is no inside and they can't be seen, so that's a little gotcha. Make sure it's aligned to one of these. So if we make this nice and fat, well, a little too fat, sorry, getting carried away there. Let's look at the caps right now. We have flat, which where the end of the path is, where the node is on the end of that path, there's a perpendicular end to that stroke. I can put that node anywhere and redraw that path, and it's going to just be completely perpendicular to that. So if the path was curved, it would again be perpendicular to the tangent of that path. I won't get into that too deep right now. Let's look at the cap options. I can have round caps, as you can see, create a nice round cap to the stroke, a nice round end. We have like a 50 pixel width stroke, so it creates a 25 pixel radius around that point, so that that circle, that radius is sort of dead center, and that's how you get that nice rounded cap. Create a square, create a new shape layer, and I'm just going to, with the direct selection tool, I'm going to select one of the nodes and then delete it. Now we have an open shape, and now we have the fill, which, if you think that the shape isn't closed, Photoshop, again like Illustrator, will just calculate an imaginary line between the two open endpoints and just create a straight line there. We can turn off the fill and just have ourselves a straight. Makes it a little harder to select. There we go. Yeah, open paths get to be a little harder to select, a little more cumbersome. Now we can look at the the caps. So the caps, there's a butt cap, as I said. Let's put this on the center. And then rounded caps. And then square caps. Like I said, they just create a square around that endpoint. Select the layer. Select the path. Let's give it a rounded corner, which rounds that corner. Let's give it a rounded end, and we've got, you know, quite a nice geometric shape just from two paths, or from one path with two angles. Okay, let's get into the color. I can select the object on the layer, and then I can go back into the color palette. I can have no fill, I can have a solid color fill, I can have a gradient fill, and I can have a pattern that I can, you know, from any of the patterns that are available to my system. And there are, if I can load patterns here. Elsewhere, for other tools in Photoshop that use patterns, it'll all pull from the same engine, and you can load them and manage them there. So let's just go back to a solid fill. Gradient, we talked about gradients in the previous episode, and they behave in exactly the same manner. Let's go back to the rainbow one that I created in that last episode. This is where, again, like everything else, it will pull from the same library. Let's just use a solid color for now. And again, same with swatches. I can load swatches from a library stored on my system, from the presets that are stored somewhere on my system, and it behaves in much the same way as everything else does when you're loading and saving libraries in Photoshop. The stroke is exactly the same. I can have no stroke, I can have a solid, I can have a gradient, and I can have one of the patterns. And again, I can load whatever swatches, patterns, gradients, whatever. I can load and save those from the little drop down right here. Let's go back to a solid, and let's just make that and make it a little bit smaller. So that's the color options. And again, you can set all these up as soon as you select, you know, hit the U key and you select that. You can choose these before you draw, and then you can draw and it will abide by those. Also, as you just saw, I can select the layer, I can select the shape, and then I can make my color changes after drawing it. It works exactly the same way, and you can save the document, you can leave it for a month, come back to it. And the great thing about these shape layers is you can then, you know, they're vector, so they're non-destructive. You can come back in and change the color and the stroke, the size of the stroke, the size. You know, I can transform any of these, you know, huge, and then transform it back down again, and it's not going to degrade in quality. That's the beauty of using shapes vector. So that's color and stroke and fill. That's the generation of shapes and the coloring of shapes. Let's look at how we can manipulate shapes. Right now, like I said, I've created 3 separate layers. When I draw a new shape, it defaults to creating a new layer. If I hit U key and I'm ready to draw, we have these options up at the top here. And the first one is new layer. That's what it defaults to, is to create a new layer every time I join, every time I draw a new shape. If I want to join the shapes together, I can then draw a new shape and have it to combine shapes, which means if I draw a rectangle over this one, these 2 shapes are now on the same layer, 2 shapes on the same layer that I can select independently and move around independently, transform independently, or as a group by holding down Shift I can then... The one thing they do share is these color properties. The properties of the color and stroke are for the layer, and all the shapes inside join together to describe that layer. And when shapes are combined like this, you can see that the layer looks at the shape, the combined shape as a whole. And let's see, if we look at the stroke option, if I give it rounded corners, you can see it's going to round all those corners. If I align to center, the whole, I can't align this to the center and align this to the outer. These options up here apply to the entire shape. So you can see I've got rounded corners on the inside here and on the outside here. So that's just the way that the shapes work. Now, let's see, let's draw another shape on this little group here. This time I will draw a, let's just do a polygon. Now the polygon tool is interesting, because with the polygon tool, if I click, I've got the box up here that says how many sides. I can make it 3, which is the least you can do. Obviously you can't have a 2-sided object. So 3 will give me a triangle. And if I draw... Right, so with the polygon options, I can have how many sides I want. It can have a hexagon, an octagon, triangle. But also in here, it can smooth the corners, which will give us that sort of flower look, or it can give us a star shape, so that it's a 3-sided polygon, but really it's not 3-sided. It's drawing in the center points of those sides. So the sides are described by these outer points, but the center points are drawn in, and the star, you know, you can increase the starriness, the pointiness by this indent sides by. If I just do it by 10%, you can see this, the triangle is very, very, very soft compared to this star. Okay, so let's delete those. I'm just going to turn off star and just give myself a straight triangle. I'm going to hold shift, which, there, whoops, hold it that way to anchor it to the flat bottom, and put this shape over the top. Now you can see this has been joined. Didn't want to do that. Let's try that again, the same shape. This time I'm going to, rather than create a new layer, I'm going to subtract the front shape. And as I'm drawing each layer, like I said, it's like layers within layers. So within a shape layer, you have lots of different objects, and they all obviously have a hierarchy. Each subsequent layer, each subsequent shape that you draw is stacked hierarchically on the previous shapes. And that's important to remember, because when we're doing some more complex compound manipulations, where they are in the stack will determine that. So I'm going to hold down shift and make sure it's that way again. I'm going to hold down space and position the triangle inside. And now you can see, because I had subtract, I've now created these are like Boolean operations. I have subtracted the triangle from the rectangle. I can subtract the triangle from the sum of the triangle and the circle, and get some fairly complex shapes. Again, there's no limit to how many shapes you can build up and how many of these compound interactions. So let's, if I bring this triangle over here, I can set these operations every time I draw. Also, I can select the shape inside the layer and change its compound interaction after it's been drawn. So now I have set the triangle to intersect, and as a little icon shows, it's intersecting where the two shapes overlap. That is what will be rendered. So the triangle, because it's on the top of three layers, three shapes in a hierarchical stack. The circle is at the bottom of the stack, then we have the rectangle, then we have the triangle. What the triangle sees is the sum of the rectangle and the circle. It sees that as one layer. So it's not interacting with the layer beneath it, it's interacting with everything beneath it, because it sees the sum of everything that's already passed. And again, when you're creating quite complex compound interactions, these hierarchical positionings is very important. So that's how we get this, fairly complex shape with fairly little work. I've created three primitive shapes, arranged them in such a way, and then combined them in such a way. So finally, the final compound area is Exclude, which means it will ignore the area that is intersecting. It's like the reverse of intersection, where all the shapes overlap. It will ignore those areas in the final rendering. So, which is how we get to this. And can I change that to none with it? Yes. So I don't even have to have a shape selected. As long as the layer is selected, whatever is going on up here in the colorways, I can then change it. I don't actually have to physically have a layer, a shape selected within it. It gets quite mentally cumbersome. Obviously, when I'm describing it, it can be quite cumbersome. When you're doing it and you're just designing and laying out, you're not thinking in terms of labels of shape, layer, whatever. You're just doing. So, and of course, because it's vector, I can scale, reposition without any kind of degradation. If I hold down Option, if I've got the black arrow selected and I hold down Option, I can then Option drag another layer and duplicate it. And I can take that and then do a different path interaction. And I can continue to do this, repositioning, building up. Now say I like the way that this circle happens, but the triangle, I wish that I'd punched the triangle out of that before the circle was there. So what I can do is select that and then bring it to the front. What I was talking about, the different shape objects within the layer, the hierarchy of the shapes within the layer, I can manipulate those by bringing it to front, sending it to the back, bringing it one layer forward at a time. So those complex compound operations you want to do you have absolute control over. You can build up quite complex shapes within one layer of Photoshop. Now, why is that great? Because now I can go to the FX and I can add a stroke. The stroke's not really a big deal, but I can add an let's see, outer glow and a drop shadow. I can add a gradient overlay. Gradient I can add as well, so there's no big deal to the stroke or gradient overlay, but these things I can not really getting into the effects objects, but I can apply these layer effects, these layer styles to this compound shape. And all the transparencies within it, they're all seen by the, so I'm just going to clear that. So that's why it's really cool that we have this engine inside of Photoshop that gives us all this versatility, all this power inside one layer. So let's carry on exploring what else we can do with these. So right off the bat, I had created these separate layers. Maybe I wasn't aware, I've created a new layer rather than wanted to combine these. Well, I can take this path and I can then do my regular computer operations like copy, paste, cut and paste. In this case, I'm going to cut. X will delete that layer. That path is now stored in memory in its position. I can select the next layer and I can paste, and it inherits the color properties and stroke properties of that layer, but pastes the vector path, the coordinates where those nodes are, the tangents and all that. It's just going to paste that data into the color rendering layer of that. Now I have these two paths here. I can shift click and select them both, and I can cut those, and I can select this final layer, and I can Command V and paste these in, and now these are joined, and these are at the sort of top of the stack. So we have this complex shape. Certain times there might be, you've created an arrow or a logo out of these compound shapes, and you wish you didn't have to shift click them all the time. Now I've created this, I want to, you know, align this shape with some other shapes I'm about to do, and I don't want to have to shift click everyone all the time. Well, what I can do is I can draw a box around them, select all these shapes. At the very bottom I can merge shape components. This is like making a compound path in Illustrator. Now this is one big compound path. These are no longer separate shapes. I can no longer move them back and forward in the stack, the hierarchy. Now it's just one shape. But what I can do then is, want to illustrate, is the power of adding other objects to a compound. If I let's see, the rounded rectangle, I can take my radius up to 25. Let's assume we've still got it on combine. I'm going to draw that again, and I'm going to position it, and I've obliterated everything I've just drawn. Shape layers to Photoshop are just, I mean, they're just pixels. It's just a layer full of pixels, and where we're drawing the vector shapes, they really just amount to vector masks, and I will get to that in just a moment. It's just how Photoshop has broken this one function inside of Photoshop into different tools, how we approach the same thing from different angles. So, and what I mean by that is, if I have this rectangle now and I set that to subtract front shape, all right, now we just got a page full of nothing. If I deselect that, it's all gone away. If I then take this and send it to the back, what we have now, without actually having drawn anything, a shape layer is just a color fill layer with shapes on it that are vector masks. And I can, to illustrate that point, I can do the same thing. I can do layer, fill layer, solid color, and whoops, apparently I don't know the difference between OK and cancel. Fill layer, solid color, yes, yes. So I have a color fill layer, and you see it already gives us this little mask here, and I believe that's a layer mask and not a vector mask. I can delete this and find out for sure. So it's just a color fill layer. It's just wall-to-wall pixels, which is exactly what this is. But it's because we approached it as a shape layer and put these masks on it. Internally, the rendering stack is going to give us the same results, because I have the very lowest shape on the hierarchy. The stack is this, which is set to subtract. What's it subtracting from? It's not subtracting from another shape, it's subtracting from the whole layer. So that's what I'm really driving at, that's what I'm getting to. So let's take a look at this color fill layer and draw a shape into it. So if I've got the shape tool selected and it's set to shape and it's set to new layer, it's just going to give me a new shape layer, even though I've got color fill 1, the layer selected. If I set to combine shapes and I draw in here, it's still going to, if I set it to subtract, it's not going to allow me to do that because I don't have a shape layer. I don't have a shape layer sort of selected. Here I can make those selections. I can't because it isn't visible. Now I can make these compound interactions, and it will honor them. But when I'm talking about a layer that isn't a shape layer, none of this is recognized. You can see I can make these selections, it's not going to do anything. However, if I go to path, and I'm not sure if this is going to work first time. Hopefully it will create a vector mask, but we will see. And it's set to subtract. No, it didn't do it. So let's... What that did is it created a work path. Now, work paths are a kind of a thing of the past. It's not really used that much anymore, saving paths, because we have selections and masks and layers, and it's so easy to create, you know, our selections, and these paths were really used to make our selections and save them. Lots and lots of work paths saved, so we could go back and use them later. I haven't used paths in the paths palette in this sort of context for a long while. However, with this work path selected, and I've created that, let me back up and go over that again. I've got my color fill layer. It doesn't really matter, because apparently when I'm creating a path with the shape tool, before I had shape selected and it was going to create a new shape layer, it's going to create a new path layer. Well, a path layer is going to go into the paths palette, and I'm going to draw my rectangle, and now it's created a new work path, which I can double click or just drag onto the new icon, and now it's saved as path 1. Work path is like a kind of like a temp path. I think it goes away once you quit Photoshop, but now it's saved. This path is saved, and again, like layers, you can have limitless paths, and they're resolution independent. So I've got this path, I can select it, and paths are manipulated with the black and white arrow tools. I can click off, you know, in the palette to hide it. I can click on the path, and then I have to click on the path to select it. So again, let's back up. If I deselect everything, I click off, nothing is selected. I've selected the path layer, but I haven't selected the path object. Then click on that. Now I've selected the path object. Now I can maneuver it or do any of these operations: fill, stroke, select, all of those operations. But it's this one that I want to add a layer mask. No, I don't want to add a layer mask. I want to add a vector mask. I think this is the one I want to do. If I click on that, and hide the paths palette. Yes, so that is exactly. Let's back up and go over that again. You've seen me on lessons before, you know, add layer masks, and layer masks is, you find them down here in this little icon, or layer mask up here. Up until now, I've demonstrated just bitmap raster layer masks, how we can, you know, go to our channels and duplicate these and turn a black and white raster image into a layer mask. The thing with paths, if I go to the path and I delete that again, select the path, select its shape, go to the layer that I want, which was layer, I don't know why I suddenly deleted my fill layer, solid color, yes. So with the path already selected, creating a new layer automatically turns that path into a shape layer, which was not what I was hoping to demonstrate, but it's also a pretty cool shortcut. You can paste paths from Illustrator, you can copy paths from another Photoshop document. So conceivably, you could have paths in your Photoshop path palette that aren't doing anything, that you can then convert to a shape layer that then you can apply all of these functions that I demonstrated earlier. I'm going to backtrack again because that took a tangent that I wasn't expecting. Let's go back to adding our fill layer, solid color once again. Let's delete the layer mask. I have our solid fill like we did before. I've got my path in the palette. Select the path with this color fill, layer, vector mask, current path. So, geez, that was a long way around that. So it's taken, the path is still saved in our paths palette, which could be useful to have that path for later on for other objects. It could be a logo, it could be an arrow that we use often. And again, we can save it as a symbol. There's lots of ways of achieving the same thing. But let's say we've just got this path and we've saved it, and we want to use it again. So we've saved it to our paths palette. By having a color fill layer, apply a vector mask to it, and you can see the icons now are the same, which, rewinding to about 10 minutes ago, we have a shape layer, which is essentially a color fill layer with a vector mask applied to it. So that's the long and short of that. We can apply vector masks to this is a smart object. Now you can probably see this around. That is because that sort of definition of the path. If I go back to my paths palette, I still have the path selected. That's a little bit of an annoying sort of leftover from Photoshop of yore. If you're seeing sort of ghost of a path, it's probably because you've got a path in the paths palette selected. And so anyway, I've got my path selected, I've got my shape selected, and then I can go to layer, vector mask, current path. And now go back to my layer. I've got this photograph that I have a vector mask applied to. Now that's really no different. This is a shape layer. It's got the icon of a shape layer. This is a shape layer. It's got the icon of a shape layer. But like I said, for all intents and purposes, it's really just a color fill layer with a vector mask on it as far as the rendering stack goes. This is a raster. It's a bitmap layer with a vector mask. Just visually, as it's presented to us in the layer palette, it's a little bit different. Now, I can select the vector layer mask with my arrow tool. I can then select this mask and then move it. I can then select, let's see, let's go to a circle. I can hold down Option Shift and then add or intersect, or after the fact I can do combine. I can Option drag paths. And much like I did with a shape layer, which, as I said, I'm going to hammer this home, it's basically a color fill layer with a vector mask, a raster image with a vector mask, I can apply the same functions, the same hierarchical functions, and the same combining the shape, Boolean functions. What a vector mask doesn't do, obviously, is any of this color, because it's a mask now. It's not got any color properties. The color properties apply to the shape layer, nay, a color fill layer. So a couple of different ways that the vector engine, really what we're talking about is the vector engine within Adobe Photoshop. So it all behaves the same way regardless of what layer, what type of layer we have, whether it's a path, whether it's a color fill, it could be a path in the paths layer. All of these functions, they behave the same way. One final look at what the vector engine, the shape tool, does. If we just put it into pixel mode, all this does, now you can see right now I can't do anything. I've got this cursor The meterboard says no. If I select the background layer, which is just, the stock, now I can, I've got the crosshairs, I can do something. I can then, all it's doing is creating pixels in that shape that I have drawn. I can't, now I can't do anything after the fact. I mean, I can blur them because they're pixels. It's just pixels now. It's no longer vector. What I can do is when I'm drawing it, I can reposition. Stuff. Swap the colors and do another one. But it's just pixels. I can't do anything with it. Other than that, I'm not really sure. The pixels function, the pixels mode is there, but it doesn't really have the full vector engine that Path or Shape does. One thing, let's take one last look at what we didn't cover. Let me just create let's change that fill. So I've got one shape layer here and I've got one shape object in it. I can then just option drag and duplicate this a number of times. Okay, that's pretty cool. Well, I can shift click to select all of these, and then I can use align and distribute commands to position them. So I can align the left edges or align them horizontally. Let's take a look at that. If I scale this one, so he's a little bit bigger. If I select all of these now, if I align the left edges, you can see they're all aligned to the left. And again, if you ever use any graphic program, especially Illustrator, you know what align and distribute does. If I align it to the center, you can see. If I distribute the heights, now they're spaced evenly by height, not by center. Well, yes, by center, not by volume. There is a really cool function in Illustrator that basically distributes the spacing. So as you can see, the centers are evenly distributed, but because this large one at the center, it looks like they're not spaced that evenly. Illustrator has a really great, and of course it's more designed for this sort of thing, where you can distribute the spaces between each one. That's really, really handy. So another thing that I should just cover real briefly, that's not too complex, align and distribute, but you can make the alignment to the selection. That means you're aligning it to each of them. They're all aligned to the left within their relative positions. Or I can align it to the canvas. And when I do that, if I align center, now these all fall within the canvas, or within the actual document, they're dead center. If I distribute the height again, it doesn't really distribute it amongst the center. Yeah, well, I thought it might be nice if distributing to the canvas, it would automatically, put this up here and this down here, and then spread the rest. But it's not smart enough to do that. It's a subset of the vector engine in Illustrator, but it's still really powerful, can still do, a lot. What I've drawn here is just like some, modern art mumbo jumbo. It's nothing you'd ever use, but it illustrates the power of combining the shapes, of stacking them, doing Boolean operations, and also doing the same thing as masks for photographs, and then even combining that with raster masks on photographs. So a lot covered, and it's gone on quite a long time. Anyway, we all learned something here today. Hopefully you can take away something that you can use in your work, whatever that may be in Photoshop. Obviously, it's a really powerful tool used by designers, photographers, software, user interface designers, web designers, motion graphics animators, video editors. It's like, it really is the one tool for like everybody. So I'm sure you've learned something useful today. If you have, please consider subscribing for regular, tips and tutorials in Photoshop and lots of other creative tools, both analog and digital, and consider giving a thumbs up or a like wherever you are. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Go out and be creative. See you next time.